Please welcome now to the Imus Morning Program, political commentator and analyst, Carl Jeffers. Good morning, Mr. Jeffers.
Good morning, Don. Good to be with you today.
How are you, babies?
Okay, I'm doing all right.
Where are you?
No problem. Actually, on the East Coast in Baltimore today, still working with my mom, who's recovering from a bad fall. And then once you get up to close to 90, any kind of a fall is as dangerous as anything can be to someone who's elderly and trying to manage their health. So we're nursing her back to health. Otherwise, I would be up there and join you in the studio.
Well, we don't need to have you in the studio. Then
okay, then that's good to know for future reference.
I much prefer people on the phone. You know why? Because then I don't have to give them any coffee.
Right.
Or put any makeup on them or anything. So
handshake.
Well, I'm a cheap date because I don't drink coffee and I have my own makeup. So there you go.
So what's going on? So why did Ferguson blow up?
Well, I think that clearly the Ferguson situation blew up because what precipitated it was the release of the report by the Justice Department. I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the release of that report clearly showed that what we've been dealing with in Ferguson is not just individual acts of police abuse potentially, but in fact a systemic system of bias and prejudice, Don, and that's what the report said. And I give kudos to the Justice Department for the objectiveness in which they approached this. They did not find enough evidence, and they said that clearly. They did not find enough evidence to indict Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot Michael Brown. They said that was unsupportable and without merit.
Apparently, they didn't find any evidence.
They didn't find evidence, but that's my point. There were many who wanted, this was not a witch hunt. There were many in Ferguson in the community who wanted the Justice Department to, in their view, finally provide justice by coming down with an indictment on Darren Wilson. That did not happen because the Justice Department clearly did their job, and based on their findings, there was no evidence to support that. But what they did find was a pattern, a system of bias and abuse and prejudice that was even worse because it went to the entire force. And this is something that permeates police departments and the justice system throughout the country, and they were specific. This is one of the first times, Don, when I have seen a specific charge that the African-American community, through abusive and clearly disproportionate singling out for fines and parking tickets and things of that nature, were being used to fund the operations of the overall police department. That is a specific climate of prejudice and bias. I didn't even say racism, just bias and prejudice would be under any community, and that needs to stop, and it needs to be pointed out. And I will tell you that African Americans, by the way, Don, have been concerned about that for years. What was it, 2 years ago or a year ago on your show? And Tony Powell and I talked about it after the interview. I told you that I had driven to Syracuse. This is in New York State for Thanksgiving with my family, and I had noticed 6 cars that had been pulled over by police, and 5 of them were African American drivers in the rural section of New York State. They had to work hard to find 5 out of 6.
Hey, let me ask you this: talking to Carl Jeffers here in the Imus Morning Program. Are there any statistics to suggest that black cops are better in black communities than white cops?
Actually, that's a very interesting point, Don. I have not seen any studies to show that they are better in terms of the results, because that's hard to quantify. But here's what you can expect: that in a community where there is a significant percentage of African American residents, that it is comfortably commonplace and expected that there would be representation, not necessarily proportionate. That's a quota system that we don't have to argue that debate anymore. But if 30% of the community is African American, and in Ferguson it's close to 70%.
Yeah.
But if 30% even of the community is African American, you certainly would expect to have more than 2. And that's, by the way, the number of police officers on the Ferguson police force at the time that Michael Brown was shot. 2 police officers. It's only reasonable, Don, to expect that. Now, from the standpoint of view of the attitude of the community, I would say to you, Don, that an African American will feel less threatened in terms of whether he may be facing some type of violent response by the police officer, whether he did anything or not, if the officer is African American, than if it's a white officer, because particularly among young African American males, Don, there is such a heightened sense of mistrust among that group with white police officers and white symbols of authority that any change in that visual in terms of who they see coming out of the police car towards them will improve their feeling. Sometimes, by the way, there's cross-cultural things. There's sometimes problems with Hispanic police officers and African Americans, or African Americans and Hispanic citizens.
How about Asian cops?
Well, there are certainly possibilities there,
Wow.
and occasionally you see that, but it's not. It hasn't been quantified as much. Let me tell you something. What would be very interesting to research, Don, is situations where, and African Americans will tell you this, and Tony Powell will tell you this, where when you only have one or two African Americans on a police force, there are times when they feel like they have to work so hard to fit in, to be accepted by their white brethren on the force, that they go overboard to try to equal the kind of abuse that some of their white cops provide in order to compensate.
Okay, I just hired a guy who's African American. T-Money is his name, to work at the ranch in Brenham. He's a famous guy in the rodeo world, and he's a driver and he's a cowboy, and he's a great guy. So I have Bo do a thorough FBI-like background check on him. Mm-hmm. So the guy has a perfect record. No, he has no record, but he has a bunch of traffic tickets. Yeah, he's been stopped for traffic. So Dave and I are looking at it, and he's black now. We're looking at it, and every stop was going 1 to 10 miles per hour over the speed limit. I said, what? How do you get stopped for that? Well, he's driving these big, expensive, $250,000 horse trailers and $150,000 trucks and so on. So almost every one of these citations that he'd gotten is because he was black. So you're right. That's
now they generally don't write that on the citation.
Oh well, no, they don't. But if I can look at a background check on somebody and figure that out, I mean, how blatant is that?
And I'll tell you, Don, that there's two components to that. One is that there have been traditionally many situations where white police officers who are working class professionals and their incomes are relatively limited in terms of the range of the incomes they're making. When they see an African American with a big SUV or
absolutely, you're done. You're pulling over now. Hey,
they're going to pull you over.
I got one final question for you.
You're absolutely right, Don.
I got one final question for you. If you'll shut up. Let me ask you the question.
Calm down.
I look forward to it.
Is Big Mama gonna survive this Hillary to be the nominee?
Oh, I think that you could have done better than that for a question. This isn't even worthy of the level of the Hillary campaign. I mean, nobody in America is going to vote for or against a presidential nominee of her stature and her level of significance based on whether or not it was emails that she used on her private email account.
You're a communist.
As long as there's no sabotage, she didn't release classified information.
You might be a terrorist, along with a communist.
No.
Carl, two questions, Jeffers, here on the Imus in the Morning program. Carl Jeffers, I hope your mom gets better.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Carl Jeffers here now, 10 till the hour.